Visual schedules are often one of the first things that people go to when they think about implementing visual supports for pretty much anybody. This is often a starting place. And oftentimes because individuals, be they kids or adults, might be engaging in problem behavior. And engaging in problem behavior because they don't know what's happening. And so a lot of times this is kind of one of the first interventions. Let's give him a schedule, at least so he knows what's going on. That might help, right? My thought is a schedule never hurts anybody, really, because we all are walking around with these, right? And has anybody ever lost theirs? Right? It's not so bad now because, you know, if you're syncing to the cloud, you can access your calendar like on multiple devices from anywhere. So it's not the same panic if you lose your phone now than when we used to have these little books that we wrote things in. Whoever in the olden days lost their schedule book. And and the panic because there is no backup. And if you had, you know, weeks worth of appointments scheduled and now you don't know where to go, you know that feeling of, oh dear, right? So we're really just talking about the same kinds of supports that the rest of us are using to help us, for us as we age, remember where we're supposed to be and when, but also just predict and anticipate, right? How many of you start your day by kind of looking at your schedule and thinking, so what is it that I have to do today? What's going to happen today? When is the glass of wine coming in today, right? Yeah, okay. So we're all on the same page. So visual schedules, right? You can use object cues, you can use photographs, you can use graphic symbols, you can use text. It doesn't matter what kind of representation, but we're using a representation that's appropriate for the individual, and we're sequencing those representations to show what's happening first, second, third, fourth, right? A sequence of tasks. Visual schedules have been shown again in the literature. This is an area where we have a lot of research over decades on the effectiveness of using visual schedules. And typically they're used for individuals with autism or other intellectual or developmental disabilities. And again, in the research, we've had research studies done with little preschoolers all the way through to individuals in adulthood, right? So we've got evidence that shows this is a good strategy across the board. For a variety of skills. So using visual schedules to increase independence. You think about a lot of the individuals that we support becoming prompt dependent, waiting for someone else to tell them what to do instead of providing them with a schedule and teaching them how to follow a schedule on their own, right? If a person needs prompts from somewhere as an adult, I'd rather that they're taking their prompts from a schedule than taking their prompts from an individual, right? It's increased independence. I can't do everything off the top of my head, but I can follow a schedule, so if I don't know how to do something, I can get instructions. I don't need to go find a person to come and help me, right? I can be independent. So that's kind of what we're thinking about. Improving transitions, stopping one thing and going to another. We've got lots of research to show that visual schedules are really helpful for that. We also have research showing that individuals can increase their level of task engagement and task completion with the use of visual schedules, because we can have visual schedules that show them what it is that they're expected to do and for how long they're expected to do it or what they're expected to accomplish. And so by providing that kind of information, individuals do a better job of completing the tasks that we're giving them or that we're setting up for them. Visual schedules have been used to increase play skills. How many of you have young kids or possibly even older kids who don't have very good independent play skills? Right, yeah, I have lots of families where that's an issue. So the kids are fine so long as like you're there playing with them or responding to them. But if, you know, you have to go to the bathroom or do something, or you want to like talk on the phone or just like be by yourself, have a moment, right? That everything falls apart because your kids don't know how to play independently, or if they get tired of playing with one thing, they don't know how to set themselves up with something else. We can use visual schedules to teach those kinds of skills and help kids and even older individuals be more independent in sort of their leisure activities, engage in an independent leisure activity without bothering anyone for a period of time, right? That's an important skill. And then we can use visual schedules to teach a whole bunch of other sort of discrete skills related to daily living, like brushing your teeth, or making a sandwich, or doing your laundry, or grocery shopping, or doing a job task, or doing an academic task. So we can use schedules for a whole bunch of stuff. There are two main kinds of visual schedules. One is a between activity schedule. This is the traditional, first you do your math, then you have computer time, then you do your reading, then we have recess, right? Here are the different activities that are going to happen. Really, really useful to use if you're supporting somebody who has problem behavior at transitions, then this is almost always one of my recommendations, is to put in a visual schedule if there isn't one already. Because a lot of times that problem behavior at transitions is associated with a lack of predictability, right? Not knowing what's happening next. The other kind of visual schedule is what's called a within activity schedule. So this is the kind of schedule that's for one single activity, and it breaks that activity down into its steps. So what are the steps to brushing teeth? So I can have a within activity schedule for brushing teeth that shows what's step 1, step 2, step 3 for brushing teeth, right? If you've ever used a recipe in a recipe book, doesn't happen much anymore, I don't think, but, right? That's a within activity schedule, right? Following the instructions. How about a craft dinner box? That's a within activity schedule, the instructions on the box, okay? So those kinds of things. And we can use it, we could make a schedule showing how to buy a coffee at Starbucks, right? I could have this is the Starbucks coffee buying schedule, right? Step 1, stand in line. Step 2, when you get to the counter, do this. Step 3, pay. Step 4, go wait at that area. Step 5, put the lid on, so on and so forth, right? So these are things that we all use, right? We all use day planners. Most of our day planners are here. Some of us have dual, right? I've kind of also got a paper one where I take one task and then I break it down into the million things that need to happen that day, because it really does feel good when I get to cross things off. It makes me feel very accomplished. That's why I put every tiny minute task that I might have to do in my book, because, right, take 3 steps. I did that, yay! Very accomplished. Electronic calendars, right? Many of us use that. We might use recipes if any of us are still cooking on occasion, right? Thanksgiving just happened. Maybe you used a recipe for the family stuffing. Instruction sheets. How many of you know these? Where does this come from? This is just one step from an IKEA how-to guide, right? How many of you just love those? Mm-hmm. They're a visual schedule of sorts, right? It's a step-by-step for how to put things together. To-do lists are kind of like a schedule. First do this, then do this, then do this, right? So we all use these kinds of visuals in our daily life. So when we think about providing these to the children or the youth or the adults that we support, we're teaching them to use a very functional tool that everybody out in the real world uses. The form might look somewhat different, but the purpose is exactly the same, right? This is an important skill to teach, teaching individuals how to use and follow a schedule, okay? So let's start by looking at between activity schedules. So these are the ones that you're probably more familiar with. These are the ones that tell what activities are coming up. They help with transitions. They make things more predictable. For a lot of individuals on the autism spectrum who tend to get a bit stressed out when things are not predictable, visual schedules can help to reduce some of that stress, right? A lot of the individuals that I support, a lot of the individuals that my students support are individuals who live with kind of a pretty high baseline level of anxiety. They rev kind of high on the anxiety threshold anyway, at the best of times. And then if things are not predictable, that anxiety increases, right? So we can lower some of that anxiety with a visual schedule that provides some information so that people aren't always kind of living in this space of, I don't know when things are gonna change. I don't know when something different's gonna happen. Right? That's not a fun place to live. If you've ever been in that situation, I think most of us have at some point when unexpected things go on, it's often not a really pleasant place to be, right? These kinds of schedules can often help people become more independent, more on task, because again, instead of having to follow instructions from a person, they can follow instructions from the schedule, which means that the person doesn't need to be right there, Velcroed to their side, giving them support, right? Our goal is not for our children, our youth, our adults to have a staff person with them forevermore. That's not what we're trying to accomplish. We're trying to make people as independent as they possibly can be. And this is a really good way of helping move in that direction. And then for some individuals, it can decrease disruptive or problem behavior, again, because they know what's gonna happen. So, different ways that this can look. If you have an individual who requires three-dimensional objects, so the symbol assessment that we talked about earlier directly relates to what our schedule is going to look like. If I've got a kid who only understands object cues, I'm using object cues for my schedule. Like I say, it's a bit more of a hassle because you've got to think about what objects are going to represent all the daily activities, and you have to think about where are you going to store all those objects, and what are you going to sequence them in, and how are you going to make that portable. We'll talk about all those things, right? It is doable. It's, like I said, a bit of a challenge and not pleasant necessarily. It's a bit more work. But if that's what the individual requires, then that's what we should be providing, okay? So you can use object cue schedules. You can use actual objects, you can use miniature objects, and we'll talk about some caveats with that in a second. You can also use tactile cues, and I'll show you kind of some tactile cues that are not necessarily like the object, but really more for individuals with significant visual impairments who are not relying on sight at all. Then we'll be using tactile information. So then we don't necessarily need a whole object, but we need something that from a feeling perspective, feels the same as whatever it is we're trying to convey, okay? So if we're using real objects, right, it could be this. Here's the object cue for going to the doctor, and it's the bottom of a stethoscope attached to a piece of cardboard, and you can see a little bit of Braille here, right? And this was a cue for a child who's blind, and they're exposing that child to Braille as well, right? If you've got a sighted kid, you always want to be putting text on everything. Right, for two purposes. One, so that the adults always say the label correctly, right? So we all call everything the same thing. We're not, using 5 different words. But also because some kids, if they see the text enough, they actually learn what those words mean. That's not a bad thing either, right? So you just really have to think about, well, for a given activity, what's an object that's easy to carry around, easy to get, and also representative of the activity. So for example, cooking. I've used a wooden spoon before to represent cooking because, we can always bring a wooden spoon into the cooking activity, right? Or mealtime, a spoon or a fork makes sense because that's what a person uses to eat. For painting, a paintbrush, because that's what the person's using to paint. Computer, get an old computer mouse. Cut the cord off, the mouse is the cue for computer, right? I've had people go and get an old keyboard and pop off a couple of keys and mount the keys on a card, right? So you get creative and think about what's gonna make the most sense to this person that's gonna represent the activity well, okay? So real, actual objects. We can also use miniatures, right? So that's like go to the craft store or the dollhouse store and you can get little teeny tiny things. So for example, reading could be a book magnet, right? It looks like a book, but it's a magnet for your fridge. You could use that. For the park, I might use a little Fisher-Price toy slide from a toy set, right? Because there's a slide at the park. For Dairy Queen, I might use a little toy ice cream cone. The thing that you have to be careful about, and this is where we need to kind of get in the head of our learner, just because the miniature makes sense to us doesn't mean it makes sense to the individual, right? So think about, the toy slide. So we look at the toy slide, and we see the real toy slide, and we're adults, and we've got decent language skills. We're, fairly intact in terms of all of our abilities. We make that connection. Oh, this little toy slide is the same as the slide at the park. But if you're an individual who can't demonstrate object-to-object matching, and I'm going to use a little toy slide to represent a big slide, how well do you think that individual is likely to make the connection? Yeah, right? Maybe, maybe not. Certainly we're going to need to teach it, but is it sufficiently representative for that person, right? If it's a sighted individual with autism or an intellectual disability, I might be able to pair it enough. See, here's the toy slide, there's the slide you're going down, see, they're the same, so that he gets it. Certainly if I'm working with an individual with a vision impairment or who's blind, I'm gonna be somewhat more reluctant because I'm gonna be thinking about what's the kid's experience sitting on the slide versus the experience touching this small toy slide, and are they at all the same? And my thought is, no, they're not. So then I'm gonna actually think, well, if the kid is sitting on the slide, what is he or she feeling that I might be able to use, right? Something that's more relevant. So, we always talk about individuals with autism having this thing called poor theory of mind. Individuals with autism don't do very well at sort of taking other people's perspective. I think that often as adults, we're guilty of the same problem. And we don't get into the heads of our students and think, how is he or she perceiving the world? And let's make sure that our supports are a good match for the way he or she perceives the world. And I think that we sometimes are trying to expect that they're gonna see it our way, instead of going, well, hold on here, I'm making this visual support to help you understand. I need to figure out how you see things and what makes sense to you, and I need to make a support that works for you if my goal is for you to understand things better. Right? So kind of get into the head of the person that you're supporting and think about their perspective when you're thinking about something like object cues, right? Because what makes sense to us doesn't necessarily make sense to them, right? You still might need to teach everything, right? So I worked with an individual with autism who had very significant cognitive impairments, and we were using real 3D objects. And it took on average that student to learn 5 objects. It would take a year. A year for us to get clear indication that he understood the difference between those 5 things. He was working with a very severe cognitive deficit. I couldn't make it any easier. That was as easy as I could make it. So we just had to do lots of instruction and take lots of time and be very patient about it, right? But if it were a different kid, where it's like, I know this is not about a learning challenge, I know this is about, I'm not using the right representation for you, what I'm providing you is not sufficiently clear, then I need to change something, that's me, right? I need to do something different, okay? Some kids are just gonna take a long time to learn if they're really significantly impaired, okay? The other kind of cue that you could use is a tactile cue, right? So this is most appropriate for individuals who are blind or have a very significant visual impairment such that they're not really using their vision very well. So this would be about textures, thinking about textures and shapes that are related to items, right? So if you were thinking about gym and the kid playing basketball in the gym, you know the feeling of the basketball, that sort of bumpy feeling, right? Well, what I would end up doing is I'd go get a deflated basketball and I'd cut out a square of that and I'd mount it on a card, right? Because that's the feeling of the basketball, right? Because that's what's important, that's what's relevant, not what it looks like. It's the tactile information, right? So this is an example of a little guy who is blind, and they've got cards with tactile information, things that are soft and rough and smooth and whatnot that match tactile information in the actual environment, or they've made things up, right? And created little shapes out of, plastic or whatnot, and they're teaching that this shape means that thing. They have to pair it. When you feel this is where we go. When you feel that, that's what you do. Right? So it's much more complex. That's why if you're working with a kid who has a significant visual impairment, you should be working with a vision specialist, right? Or someone, right, the people who work in deaf blindness know so much about this, because individuals who are deaf blind, we have only this channel, really, only the tactile channel to get information through. So they are really, really good at stuff like tactile cues and tactile schedules, right? Because that's what they do all the time. So if you ever come up against that kid, that's what you want to be Googling, right? Deaf blind. Because people have done some really nice work in that area and there are some resources, okay?